Let's start by looking at the Rasch dichotomous probability equation in logit form. The Rasch model expresses the logit, or the natural log or log odds of a correct response, as the natural log of the probability of a correct response over 1 minus the probability of a correct response. And that logit is equal to the difference between a person's ability and the item difficulty on the right-hand side of the equation. So, in interpreting this equation, we see that higher person ability relative to the item difficulty will result in a larger logit, and thus a higher probability of success or a correct response in this case. And, if focusing on the right-hand side of the equation, when delta sub I, the item difficulty, matches theta sub n, which is the person ability, the logit equals 0. And the only way for the logit to equal 0 is for the odds to equal 1, because it's only the natural log of 1 that can equal 0. Correspondingly, the only way for the odds to equal 1 is for the probability of a correct response to equal 0.5. As another way to look at the Rasch probability equation, let's look at the item characteristic curve for dichotomous data. Notice that we have a plot here where we have the probability of a correct response on the y-axis, and those values range from 0 to 1, as you'd expect, and across the horizontal x-axis we have plotted in logits the difference between the person's ability and the item difficulty. And as we indicated on the previous slide, when one's ability matches the item difficulty, that difference is 0, and that results in, if you go up to the curve and over, a 50% probability of getting the item correct. Also, as you would expect, when you have higher ability, let's say we were two logits in person ability above the item difficulty, right? That's going to correspond to a probability of a correct response that's perhaps around 0.9. And likewise, if our ability was 2 logits below the item difficulty, that will result in approximately a 10% chance or probability of getting the item correct. One other thing to notice is the increase in the probability of a correct response, as indicated by the slope of this line. These increases are the greatest when the person's ability is closest to the item difficulty, right in this region here where this graph almost looks linear. But as we get up here into these larger differences between person ability and item difficulty, right, the curve starts to taper off as it approaches 1, and as that difference between ability and difficulty increases up at these larger values, the increase in the probability of a correct response, that rate of change begins to taper off.